Today's report is a public service announcement of sorts. It's grim, it's certainly confronting and shocking, so fair warning up front. And I don't want to dwell on that. The public interest here, like the reason I would report this as a quote-unquote journalist, is because I want to prevent this from happening more broadly. And I can tell you that it is going to, because it concerns the death of a young man, presumably in his 20s in southeast Queensland. I'm not going to name him for obvious reasons because his family and friends are obviously still dealing with the tragedy. But there is a lesson to be learned here, and it's pertinent to all of us because we live in a world that is increasingly surrounded by lithium-ion batteries, and generally they're totally benign and very beneficial, so useful. But occasionally, when the details are wrong, events can militate and you can end up dead. Without wanting to dwell too much on the tragedy, we need to know the sequence of events. And I'm getting the facts here from the coronial investigation, the details of which were released earlier this year, roughly 2 years after the tragedy occurred. So on the 21st of March in 2022, this young chap gets home and goes through the motions, talks to a friend. See, he's just procured an e-scooter, and it's used, I'm inferring, because it didn't come with anything to charge it. So, I don't know, he probably got it on Facebook Marketplace or something. He's talking to the friend about he needs a charger, and the friend says, "Oh, I've got an e-scooter, perhaps mine will work." And this is the core of the tragedy right there, because they end up using the friend's charger on his e-scooter, and the worst possible sequence of events flowed from that on the balance of probability. So it's easy, I think, perhaps to poke the stick of low socioeconomic status into this whole tragedy, but I would argue, if you read the news, exactly this kind of thing, but with slightly different variables, occurs way too often in the most affluent apartments in New York City or in the most affluent boroughs in London, perhaps, you know, the Royal Borough of Chelsea and Knightsbridge or somewhere like that. It's just slightly different variables. The decimal point on affluence moves a couple of hops one way or the other, but the tragedy in its core is the same. And it orbits the proliferation of lithium-ion batteries and the way that we have not evolved in step with them to mitigate the risks. So let's look at this tragic sequence of events. They end up plugging in this scooter for the very first time when the friend lends them their charger. Okay? Now, I'm going to flick through the report just a little bit here because it's not in the order that I want to relay it to you, but on the section that's called Electrical Safety Examination of E-Scooter and Charger Unit, the coroner found that the scooter that was being charged had 52 volts and 1.7 amps were the charging requirements for it. So let's just ballpark that at 100 watts. 52 times 1.7 is about 50 times 2, so it's about 100 watts of charging. Charging is power. It's like when you feel radiation heat coming off a heater, you're really feeling the power. And then if you warm up, or if something placed in front of the fire warms up, it acquires energy. And there's a distinction between power and energy. But here it's really the power that matters. So the scooter wants 100 watts of input power to charge itself. And the charger that the friend donated was 84 volts and 5 amps. And 80 times 5 is about 400 watts. So the charger is capable of producing 4 times the power that the batteries in the scooter would really like to ingest. And that's a problem because the waste heat is a problem, and we'll get to that. But anyway, what happened here is the scooter is on the charge, and this dude and his girlfriend, who is also heavily pregnant, and she's staying with him this evening. They're living in a camper trailer that is parked underneath the open carport at his grandmother's house. Okay, and this is where the stick, the skewer of low socioeconomic status could be stuck into this particular problem, and also the fact that these devices were used and they had to cobble up a dodgy charger. But just change a few of the variables here and it could just as easily happen in a one-bed sit type apartment in Knightsbridge, no problem. And therefore this is a global problem, and analysing it, getting to the bottom of exactly why and how this happened so that countermeasures can be deployed is going to be critical to the safety of society into the future, right? That's why we're all here. So they stick this non-standard charger in and go to bed. And then there is a noise and very loud, warm type phenomena. Boom, 0 to rev limiter because the joint is on fire. Like the scooter is on fire. It was the source of the blaze that caused this tragedy. The young bloke wakes up. He goes for the door and manages to get through it, and it probably took him a little bit longer than ideally because the door was locked and he had to go past the flames, presumably. So he got badly burned. The girlfriend, heavily pregnant, is cowering against the wall in this situation. Scooter's on fire. He's outside. He yells, "Get out," to her. She's got her back to the fire, instinctively protecting the unborn kid. So she goes through the window and she gets badly burned as well. And the fireys are unimpeachable here. Like the call goes out to the fireys. I'll get the exact timeline, but it's only minutes. The call goes out at 11:02. The first fire crew arrives on the scene at 11:09. And the fire was reported as being under control at 11:13. So ladies and gentlemen, the fireys. Unfortunately, though, the young bloke is very badly burned and the paramedics are treating him. I think they had to sedate and intubate him at the scene. So if you ever see somebody getting sedated and intubated at the scene of a tragedy, things are looking bad for them, basically. And his burns were unsurvivable. So ultimately, he was assessed in the emergency department by specialist burn treatment doctors, and the family was informed that his burns were unsurvivable. They put him on pain medication, and he tragically succumbed to his injuries the following day. The girlfriend was also badly burnt, and she had to undergo emergency surgery to deliver the baby, but presumably she survived. So she had burns to about 50% of her body. And that just shows you how ferocious this fire was, because I'm tipping that if you've got one of these, like if you're a YouTuber, you've probably got 10, it's got a battery like this, okay? If that battery goes up on the nightstand, then there's this many chemicals that go up. If you've got dozens of batteries in an e-scooter and they start venting because they get too hot, and then the vapours that off-gas explode, and then subsequently several of the batteries themselves explode, that's a different story. It's much more ferocious. It's unlikely that little tiny battery in your camera or your GoPro or, your wireless microphone transmitter or something, it's unlikely that a battery with just the tiny amount of chemicals is going to kill you itself. It might spark up a fire that's a conventional fire that ultimately consumes the house, but it's not a massive store of reactive chemicals just waiting for the right set of inputs to change dozens of people's lives, right? It's a little bit like pouring a thimble of petrol out on a flat fireproof surface and setting it alight, and then doing the same thing with 20 litres of the stuff, right? That's what we're essentially talking about here. Anyway, so this is the backstory to this terrible tragedy. The coroner's report says there were 74 type 18650 cells, all of which were noted to have vented, and many had ruptured violently. The damage observed was identified as being consistent with an energetic failure of multiple lithium-ion batteries inside the e-scooter. It was not possible to determine the e-scooter's ability to prevent overcharging its batteries from overvoltage or overcurrent, so this hypothesis as an ignition source of the fire could not be ruled out. The electrical safety investigator advised that an uncontrolled thermal runaway event and resultant fire in the lithium-ion rechargeable batteries can be caused by a number of factors, including overcharging, mechanical damage, manufacturing defects, or by exposure to excessive external heat. The electrical safety investigator could not determine specifically if the battery failures in the e-scooter were a cause or a consequence of the fire. Balance of probability: the battery pack overheated, catastrophe ensued. And balance of probability: this occurred because it was connected to the wrong charger and for whatever reason was unable to shut itself down or otherwise protect itself. Okay? And this is so important to know because I just did a quick stock take, right? Phone in the pocket, smartwatch on the wrist, okay? I just put this on the charger behind you, but torch in the pocket. If I'm awake and up and around, this torch is in my pocket, okay? And I don't feel even slightly at risk from any of these things because they're all systematically protected and the danger is extremely low. The cameras, right? Tiny little battery in your GoPro could certainly go into thermal runaway. It could explode. If it's in your pocket when it does that, you might receive a serious burn to your leg. But unless it causes a bigger fire elsewhere, that's going to be the extent of the damage, okay? Now, I got 4 of these lights as well, and they're always on the charger. They're USB-C rechargeable, like the GoPro, like this camera, like this microphone transmitter. This torch has a USB-A magnetic charging deal, so you plug into USB-A. It's got the bespoke charger. Only an Olight charger fits on an Olight torch. Go figure. When you're talking about power tool batteries, like this is a 4 amp hour Ryobi one, 18 volts. So 18 is about 20, this is about 80 watt hours of energy. So you can see that this battery pack, which probably has a bunch of 18650 cells inside it, is dozens of these, right, in terms of its capacity. So if one of these goes up, if you drop one off a ladder and the shock damages the internals and then the battery goes into thermal runaway because there's a short, this could happen hours later, if this battery is in your ute could easily be toast. And if your ute is in your garage could easily be toast. But it's not going to be a battery fire so much that does that as a conventional fire flowing from a battery fire. If you've got electric yard tools, this is 36 volts at 4 amp hours, so that's roughly 40 times 4, which is 160 watt hours. And you're starting to see the difference in energy because it's roughly proportional to the outside shape. If you've got even bigger yard tools, this is 56 volts at 5 amp hours, so this is 280 watt hours of energy, and you can kind of see it, right? In terms of the danger posed by a potential runaway event, subsequent off-gassing and explosion or explosions, then it is to a degree proportional to the size of the pack, okay? And then when you step up to things such as personal mobility devices, bikes and scooters, and then you step up even further to electric vehicles, the risk might be low, but the consequences are astonishing, okay? And that's why we need robust risk mitigation practices in place, okay? We really need that. And you can see the relative risk just when you look at the size of the packs. Unfortunately, with scooters and bikes and electric vehicles, you don't see the batteries. Electric cars look like normal cars. There's a huge battery. Now, The other thing is, with all of these devices, they've got their own bespoke charger. The terminals on this battery are here. It goes into a Ryobi charger, which limits the amount of power that can be injected into the battery. You can't overcharge the battery, at least not easily, with the standard charger because it's a very low power device. And it's the same thing with all of these devices. These terminals inside this battery here only connect to the standard charger, and ditto this one, ditto a lot of other devices as well, including all of these kinds of devices that just connect to USB-C, because USB-C is a particular standard of electrical output and therefore overcharging very difficult. Torch, same thing. Now, the torch is interesting because it's powered by a single 18650 battery. That's what we're talking about here, right? You can see there, 18650, right? That's the battery powering this torch. If you put 74 of them together the right way, then you can power a personal mobility scooter. Easy, okay? If you put 7,000 of them together, you've got the battery pack for a Tesla. But you've also built, in a sense, a bigger bomb, at least potentially. And the problem with a lot of these e-scooters, for example, is that the e-scooter itself might have been pretty dodgy from a design point of view, because there should be protective circuits in place that detect over current, over voltage, things of that nature. There should be thermocouples inside the battery pack that shut things off when a particular dangerous temperature threshold is reached during charging or operation, like discharging. Or the way you'd actually do it in engineering is you'd say, well, what's the danger level? And you'd come back comfortably below that and you'd put the cutoff in at that point. I think it's fair to say that another problem with things such as scooters and electric cars is the operating environment. It's very harsh. I mean, this torch has been dropped several times, but it's in an aluminium box and it's quite protective, and it's only ever been dropped from like 1.5 meters maximum. Mostly rolls off a bench from time to time, or gets nudged off the bench when I've had it out. So, and it doesn't always land on the freaking concrete because most of the workshop is covered in rubber. So it's not that harsh an operating environment for even something like this torch, which I would categorise, you can see from the scuffs, etc. It hasn't been wrapped in cotton wool for its entire life. But I have no particular fear about any of these devices because there's robust, systematic protection in place. Even so, I've got charging thing set up on the wall there. You can probably see it's just next to that roll of gaffer tape. If you move from the gloves and the welding caps to that roll of gaffer tape and then you go down that wall, that's a charging station, and it's separate from everything else, and I've put it vertically so that you can't shove anything on top of it. You know, if you've got kids in your garage, they could throw a jumper on top of a battery that's charging on a horizontal surface, and that battery could then be over-insulated and heat could build up inside it. And if it's not properly protected or the protection fails, then that could lead to a fire, right? But if you stick your chargers on a vertical wall, much harder for that to happen, okay? So you've got to think about these kinds of things. How are you going to systematically protect yourself in a battery environment? It's very difficult to assess batteries for mechanical damage though, and scooters and bikes in particular, but certainly scooters the batteries are low to the ground and there are plenty of things you could jump over or whatever, and that could interfere with the waterproofing of the case, for example. There could be mechanical shocks involved, and over time the batteries could get dislodged and high resistance joints could occur in the pack. How the frickin' hell would you know? If you're a trader, you probably drop batteries fairly often, and I'd suggest that if a battery does get a big hit, you should isolate it in some way and not just treat it like, she'll be right, you know, because there's enough energy in a battery like this to burn your $50,000 ute to the ground kind of thing. So you should have a protocol in place for this stuff. One of the things I find absolutely shocking, though, in apartments, and one of the reasons why fires in apartments are such a big deal, is because you think about the way a high-rise apartment block is structured. There are basically just big holes in a rectangular block for the lift, and they're right in the center. So you've got these empty columns in the center for the lift, and then you've got hallways around the lift columns, and then you've got the doors to the various apartments. And all of the living spaces, like literally the living rooms, which may or may not lead to a balcony, but also the bedrooms, are typically on the outside walls of the building because that allows you to enjoy the view, right? And then all of the utility rooms, like vestibules and hallways and laundries, they tend to be internal rooms, right? Like they don't have windows in apartments. And that means they're between the living areas and the door, which is the only means of escape from your apartment if you're an apartment dweller. So where do you put your scooter or your e-bike? Where does it go to be charged? Because it looks a bit freaking ugly in the lounge room, and I can't imagine your missus being too happy with that and the space it occupies and the fact that it might be muddy or dirty or gritty. The lounge room, not an option, okay? So it's going in the hallway, the laundry, the vestibule, whatever. And that means it's between you and where you live and your only emergency exit from the dwelling. If it goes into thermal runaway and starts burning, what are you going to do? I suppose you could go out in the balcony and shut the door if you've got a balcony. But if you've got an apartment with no balcony, what is your fire escape plan exactly? Write it down for me, dude, because if you're in that situation and that scooter is between you and the door, where you live, and the door, then you don't have a viable escape plan from the building, do you? If your scooter does what this young chap's scooter tragically did. And it doesn't need to be connected to the wrong charger. It can just succumb to mechanical damage, water ingress, old age. Dendrites could grow through the electrolyte in the battery and short it out internally. And it could be devoid of any other mechanical damage or external influence that caused it. So you need to come to terms with this. We need to come to terms with this, because picking up the pieces from this kind of tragedy, I mean, can you imagine all of the people that these terrible injuries to these people affected? The first responders, the doctors back at hospital who had to have conversations with the relatives about transitioning to pain management and just watching the clock. Like, how grim would that be? Certainly grim for the friends and relatives. What about the kid that was delivered by emergency surgery, got to grow up with no dad, right? How tragic is that? And the girlfriend who had serious burns to 50% of her body. Imagine the skin grafts and dealing with that later. And this tragedy could have been so easily prevented by getting the right charger, charging the scooter outside in the open air. You only have to change a few of these variables. And I've talked about this before on the channel, but there's a brilliant professor named James Reason, who's the father of disaster research, right? What causes disasters? And he's got this theory. You can look it up. It's called the Swiss cheese theory. Just Google James Reason Swiss cheese. And you write down all of the risk factors in a particular activity. Okay, crossing the road's a good example. Crossing the road is potentially dangerous, but you and I, we've done it dozens upon dozens, hundreds, thousands of times, whatever, and still here. So we must have managed the risk somehow. The risk factors include traffic density, right? Width of the road, how many lanes of traffic are there? What time is it? Is it the middle of the night or is it broad daylight? Are you drunk? How old are you? Are you a kid with no road sense? There are factors like that. Okay, are you impaired by some other means? Are you able-bodied, or are you hobbling around on a hip that needs replacing, whatever, and you've made a bad decision about stepping out off the curb thinking that you're still 18 years old or something? You can write down all of these risk factors that are in play, and all you have to do is yank one of them out of play. There's also other factors like other road users. Drunk fuckwit would be one of them. Okay? Drunk fuckwit who's been disqualified from driving for 10 years is driving with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.25 with two unrestrained kids in the back. Happens all the time. Okay? Cleans up some pedestrian, and that's how they find out that he's in that condition. Okay? These factors all pertain to crossing the road, but if you drag one of them out, what happens is when there's a disaster, the factors all get thrown up into the air, and once every 100,000 throws or something, all the holes in the Swiss cheese line up, and the Grim Reaper can climb straight on through and grab you. Okay, but all you've got to do is to block it is pull one of the factors out of play, out of alignment, and there's no pathway for the disaster. It gets blocked because one of the holes is not available. The Grim Reaper goes, fuck, bad day for me. Good day for us, bad day for the Grim Reaper. So, crossing the road, okay? You could cross at a crossing if you've got a bung knee, okay? However 18 years old you still feel, if you've got a bung knee, cross at the friggin' crossing where it's safer. So that takes that hole out of alignment. Grim Reaper is effectively blocked. There's so many different ways that this disaster could be blocked, right? But the main thing is you have to understand the label that's on all the slices of cheese. So if you've got an e-scooter, then you have to have it charging in a location that you can escape from, where it's not going to impact you immediately if, worst case scenario. If you're going to charge your e-scooter, charge it with the charger that's designed to work with the e-scooter. What really worries me about electric cars, for example, is that most electric cars on the road today are fairly new. Most of them would be much younger than 5 years of age, I think, because of the exponential growth in initial take-up of EVs. The majority of EVs are young. But as cars age, as all cars age, combustion cars, electric cars, it doesn't matter what the powertrain technology is. Systems get less reliable and inevitably they fail. So you've got numerous protection systems in an EV. There's thermal cutouts, like if the battery gets to a particular temperature during recharging, the charging starts to throttle itself back, doesn't it? If the battery overheats, then the vehicle will shut down to protect it from going into thermal runaway. The cooling system is brand new, but what happens in 15 years' time when the battery's had a few nudges and the cooling system is not operating at its optimal capacity, and some of the pathways inside the battery where the actual heat is being exchanged with the fluid, what happens when they start getting atherosclerosis and the flow drops at the same time as protective circuits start to malfunction? And is there going to be any notification that that circuit is malfunctioning, or is it just going to not act when it needs to act, right? These are the questions that nobody knows about these vehicles when they get older. There's also dickheads who will want to modify the battery pack of various devices. Inevitably, people build their own battery packs for scooters and bikes, right? And I think that is a pathologically bad idea unless you are a qualified electronics technician, right? Stupid idea, obviously. So the same thing is going to happen with cars. Now, I've also got a battery on my house. It's 12.8 kilowatt hours. It's 4 modules of 3.2. And I put it on the south side of the house. If you're in America, we're upside down, so that's the shady side. Never gets any sun, in other words. And it's against a masonry wall, and there's free ventilation on the other 3 sides. So it's got good convection, in other words. The other thing about a battery for your house or these kinds of batteries is that they don't discharge very quickly. Right? Charge rates and discharge rates really matter, because how quickly you're pumping energy into the battery and how quickly you're extracting it really matter. My 12.8 kilowatt hour battery discharges at a maximum rate of 5 kilowatts. So let's say it's got this much battery. It's discharging down here at less than half of its capacity in watts, okay? When you look at an EV, it can discharge really quickly. Like you'll have let's say you got a 70-ish kilowatt hour battery pack. It could easily discharge at 150 kilowatts. So it's discharging twice as fast as the stack of energy in the battery. So you're going from less than half to twice as much. It's 4 or 5 times greater discharge rate. And many EVs are being designed to charge at 200 kilowatts, which is, if you've got 200 kilowatts of charging, then if that process is 90% efficient, you're talking about 20 kilowatts of waste heat. That's a shitload of heat. And you've got to bleed it off somehow. So the cooling system has to operate flawlessly during charging as well, so that you're not effectively jamming a 20 kilowatt heater up the arse of a battery that is potentially a very big problem if something goes wrong. So some people often bail me up, right? They call me a hypocrite for recommending batteries. How can you recommend a battery-powered device like this torch, or that battery that I've got on my home, or you've got these power tools behind you? I've heard it all, okay? They're different. It's a different thing. This battery is charging at a handful of watts, right? It's discharging at a handful of watts. This is one battery, not 7,000 of the same batteries in an EV. And it's producing generally quite a low amount of light. And these torches are designed, when you get them on maximum brightness, there's a time limit. Right? It only runs on maximum brightness for a certain amount of time, and then it defaults to a lower brightness setting so that you can't over discharge the battery. Your phone has a tiny battery that lasts for hours. Smartwatch, ditto. I can go for a walk for 2 hours and track the whole thing, heart rate, blah, 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 right? And the smartwatch is still operational. It's running on a handful of watts, and it's charging up on USB-A, which is 5 volts and 3 amps. So it can't extract more than 15 watts out of the wall. It's not 20 kilowatts of waste heat coming out of a 200 kilowatt charger inside a battery. And this is why, frankly, that I always say, if you've got an EV, great, like 2 thumbs up, that's allowed. But don't put the charger in your garage. That's insane, given the risk. You could charge up every night for 10 years and it's fine, but then on the first night of year 11, if that battery melts down, goes into thermal runaway, off gases, blows the door off the garage, creates a fireball that quickly fills your bedroom up there just above the garage with toxic smoke and all sorts of chemicals that you don't want to be exposed to, then that's unacceptable, right? You've had 3,650 really good charging experiences in your garage. Unfortunately, 3,651 was unacceptable, suboptimal, whatever, and then your name is on a report from a coronial investigation too, isn't it? And that's what I would seek to change. So I guess what I'm saying is, you live in a battery-powered world, dude. We all do. I'm happy to put this phone in my pocket every day. Happy with the torch. So useful, so safe, right? Happy with the camera gear, happy with the power tools. Electric power tools rock. I am not going to go back to combustion yard equipment anytime soon, but I am taking steps to mitigate the risk. And my question to you is, are you doing the same thing? And if not, when are you going to start?